Was your data included in the data sold to the malicious third parties? Your personal data?
Yes.
It was.
That, of course, was Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg on the hot seat for a second day in a row in Washington. Today's hearings at the House proved to be a lot tougher than yesterday's, with some pretty pointed questions on privacy and data gathering. But we talked about this on the show yesterday. Are politicians even asking the right questions here? The focus appears to be fixed on what Facebook shares with advertisers and not what Facebook still gathers about you. To discuss this, we're joined by Mara Einstein, a professor for media studies at Queen's College at City University in New York. She's also the author of the book Black Ops Advertising. And Mara, are we asking Facebook the right questions?
Well, they got closer today than they did yesterday, that's for sure. And the question they should be asking is, how are people being tracked? Not the issue about selling data was absolutely the wrong question, because they don't sell the data. And it finally got to the point where Mark Zuckerberg actually said that today. The issue has to do with how is our information being tracked. And, you know, certainly this has to do with Facebook, but it has to do with every time we go online. Going online, for lack of a better description, is a marketing research program on steroids. Right? So every time someone goes online, somebody is tracking them across the information. And that's certainly true within Facebook, that's for sure.
And I mean, you've studied this, you wrote a whole book about it, but I think a lot of people are only coming to this recently and getting a better understanding of how this all actually works. Is Congress blowing an opportunity to really hold Mark Zuckerberg to account and to get at the heart of what we're talking about, what they're doing, and what their plans are going forward here?
Absolutely. I think the biggest issue is they haven't put their foot down and say this has to be regulated. The fact of the matter is that Facebook is a private company. And they talk about the fact that they're a technology company, but the fact that they use algorithms and thereby affect what data we see or what information or stories we see or don't see means that they are, in fact, a publisher. They're not just a data company. And because of that, they should be regulated in the same way that media companies are regulated, which means that they come under the purview of the Federal Communications Commission and they have to be regulated by them. The other issue, and the big thing that I think a lot of people don't understand, is that in a traditional advertising forum, or when advertising was put on what's known as legacy media, like television, like newspapers, somebody always looked at the advertising. So before it ever hit the air. So if I was going to create an ad for Miller Beer, which was a product I used to work on, then I would present the commercial before it was even ever created, just the script, to all of the television networks and say, is this ad okay to appear on your network? And sometimes they said yes, but sometimes they said no. They would say, no, you're targeting too young an audience. And then we would have to go back and recreate the ad. The problem in an environment like Facebook is that there are millions and millions of ads going out into the internet, and nobody's looking at what those ads are. The other part of the equation that makes this particularly pernicious is that a lot of the advertising that appears on these spaces is created to be deceptive, is created to appear as if it is not advertising. And this is what's known as native advertising or branded content. And while most people will say, and even the so-called digital natives will say, oh, we know this advertising and we can tell that when it occurs, the fact of the matter is they don't. And what research has shown is that only 17% of people recognize when they are engaging with this sort of deceptive advertising. And we're not just talking about people of my generation, we're talking about middle school kids. Kids who should know how to tell the difference between when something is editorial content and when something is advertising content.
Right, and there's literacy around what that content is. There's also literacy around the exact points that you're just making about what Facebook's corporate relationship is with these third-party developers, with the apps, with the APIs, and how that all works. And I guess, I mean, we heard a congressman yesterday ask Mark Zuckerberg how he thought they could sort of manage some kind of regulation of Facebook. It feels like the politicians in this are just at a loss as to how to deal with that. And I guess my question then becomes, does that just play into Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook's hands here?
Well, I think it does, and I think what we really saw yesterday was how out of their league the senators were when it came to this particular area. It was embarrassing, frankly, to watch them ask some of the questions. And I will tell you, quite frankly, I sent a copy of my book to every senator a month ago on my own dime, because I thought it was really important for them to understand how this space works. And I could tell that most of them didn't read it. And if they had, they would have come to, right? If they had, they would have come to ask much smarter questions when it came to what Mark Zuckerberg is doing. Because what he talked about is one of the things that Facebook is now doing in response to some of the issues they had is that they're not letting third-party companies connect their data to the data that Facebook has. And okay, that's a nice start. But somebody said today in the House, which I think was really smart, it's the same thing with the oil companies in the early 1900s. They got to the point, they were smart guys, they built big companies, and then the companies got too big for them to be able to manage. Well, and when that happened, ultimately the government stepped in and regulated it. The same thing is true with Mark Zuckerberg. And from what I can tell from what people are saying about him, is that he doesn't really like being the CEO. And I think we could see that from the way he testified over the last couple of days. Because he wants to create the technology. He wants to keep talking about AI. He wants to complicate the issue and make it feel like it's very complicated so people can't understand it. But the fact of the matter is he's running a very large company, and he needs to take responsibility for what the problems are that have come out in relationship to his company. The other thing that I would say about this is it's been in the industry's best interest to make this feel as complicated as possible. If they can say, oh, you don't understand this, and talk about AI, and talk about APIs and KPIs and all these sort of things, and get very jargony, which is what Mark Zuckerberg did oftentimes when he didn't want to answer a question, is he jumped into jargon. It's not that complicated. And in the same way we don't know how a television set works, we can still understand how advertising affects us. The same thing is true when it comes to Facebook and the rest of the internet. We don't need to know how Facebook works. We just need to know what Facebook is doing and how they're tracking us and how we can take responsibility for whether or not we want to be involved in that process.
But Mara, therein lies the frustration here. If the politicians don't have the digital literacy to figure that out and to read your book and better understand it, and the company is sort of dodging a lot of those questions, deflecting them, and saying, well, leave us to sort of regulate ourselves. How do we get to a place where this is better, if not properly managed?
Well, we have to, people, I hope, over the last couple of days have paid attention to what's been going on in terms of these hearings, and that they will contact their legislators and say to them, look, we should have the same sort of regulations here in the United States that they do in Europe. Because frankly, when I was doing the research for the book and I talked to people who did work in Europe, they said, oh my God, there's things we can do here in the States that we would never get away with in Europe. And so we've allowed it to happen. And a lot of it has to do with our own ignorance. And let me say, I don't use the word ignorant as in a derogatory manner. People don't understand because they've been put in a position to not be able to understand. And this was something, I worked in the industry for 15 years and became an academic and worked as an academic for 20 years. And I had to teach myself this stuff because people in the industry weren't going to talk about it. And the only way the people in the industry talk about it is to say, oh, people understand. They don't understand. And it's up to us both to educate ourselves and then to educate our legislators and tell them they need to do something about this. Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook is not a technology company. It's a media company, and it needs to be regulated like one.
Really good points, Mara. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Mara Einstein, a professor for media studies at Queens College, City University of New York, and the author of the book Black Ops Advertising.